Okay, thank you very much. Thank for the organizer for inviting me. I appreciate the fact that you include in the agenda in the trial session the registries. We are still in the process of considering that as a potential data source for trials, but we are getting closer and closer, and there is an increasing interest in registry data for making better use of this data for effectiveness results. So this is a mandatory slide. So this is a personal view, it's not my view, and it's not also the view for the committees, for the working parties of the European Medicine Agency. So consider that as a lecture that just is personal lecture, that's not on behalf of EMA. And clarification about registries. I think that Giuseppe already pointed out the rationale for registries and the use for the registries in the post-marketing phase. And so to give more flavor on the role of the registry, I wish to clarify some definition and some role of the registry in the post-marketing assessment. I want to give also more inputs that already done about the rationale and the objectives entailing the use of registries in the academic and the regulatory environment, and to give some tips, methodological tips, in the way, in the best way for planning a registry and for assessing the quality of the registry themselves. And so definitions, I think that you come across some flavor of what is a registry across this day, probably even tomorrow, but the concept of non-interventional study is something in between regulatory and scientific world. Non-interventional emphasize the fact that the treatment are decided by healthcare providers and not per protocol. Registry in general make use of the typical epidemiological design of the cohort study, and they collect the real-world information, which basically, according to the definition of the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcome Research, is something that is not collected in the context of the clinical trials. So everything else that is collected outside the clinical trials. And probably it's important to understand from the regulatory point of view what non-interventional study means. This is based upon the clinical trial regulation that was issued in 2014. And what I did is I get everything that is outside what is the definition of the clinical trials, which can be defined as a non-interventional study. And so non-interventional studies are those studies where the investigational medicinal products are already authorized, and according to the protocol of the clinical study, the investigational medicinal products are used in accordance to the term of the marketing authorization. So basically you are studying something that is already authorized and based upon the specific indication in theory, and based upon the indication and contraindication. Third point, the assignment of the subject to a particular therapeutic strategy is not decided in advance. This is, I think, crystal clear. And the decisions to prescribe the investigational products is not taken together with the decision to enroll patients into the registry. And finally, the diagnostic monitoring or procedure, in addition to normal clinical practice, are not applied to the subject, which means that theoretically, in the registries, you cannot perform any additional diagnostic monitoring other than what you are supposed to do in your normal clinical practice. I think that the last 2 points are relevant because in assessing the registry, sometimes there are some member states that argue whether you can consider this a non-interventional or you can consider this as a clinical trial. So there is a lot of discussion about that. And according to the regulation, sometimes in the European regulation about the last point, diagnostic or monitoring procedures, there is a bit of flexibility left to the member states. So according to the country, sometimes there is much more flexibility to perform further diagnostic monitoring than the normal established clinical guidelines. But this is always a matter of discussion. So I think that is intuitive what cohort studies are. You start with the population and risk. You follow up this population until an event occur. Clearly, there is the population at risk with some characteristics, can be drug exposure, but also other risk factors. And so, obviously, you can derive the incident rates for outcome of interest accordingly. And so, if you keep going on the definition of the registry, according to probably the most comprehensive guide, which is set up by American agency, the patient's registry is an organized system that uses observational study methods to collect uniform data to evaluate specified outcomes for a population defined either by a disease or by a condition or by a specific exposure. What semantically define and distinguish a registry study from a cohort study basically is the fact that theoretically, in principle, a registry is aimed to collect information without any hypothesis testing, and then using the information collected into the registry, maybe you can also set up cohort study with a specific hypothesis testing, and so with the sample size calculation and with a specific outcome. And so there are some basic rules for data collection. It's clear data are collected in a naturalistic manner, so not per protocol. The registry is designed clearly for fulfilling some specific purposes before the collection of the data. There is also, this is distinguished the information collected using prospective registries from the information from healthcare databases that are generally retrospective registries that are set up for several other purposes. In this case, you collect information based upon a specific clinical definition, whereas in the retrospective registries, you derive a possible clinical definition using complex algorithm, and you are not certain that acute myocardial infarction is truly an acute myocardial infarction. Other point is that the data are collected in a possible homogeneous manner, and that the data collected reflect the clinical status of the patients. Theoretically, the information that you have is the same information that you need as a physician to manage your patient. So you can distinguish two types of registries that are product registries and disease registries. I think that for learned societies, academic societies, disease registries are much more common, whereas in the regulatory world we rely mostly on product registries, and I will explain you why then. Clearly, the disease registries are definitely much more useful, are the preferred way to collect information for several reasons. First of all, because you don't have some bias, like the fact that the physicians which collect information do not collect information on a specific drug products, and so it's less biased to, how can I say, be more efficient in the way they treat the patients rather than in a disease registry. Second, the presence of comparators groups, because if you collect information based upon a disease, clearly what you have is several possible treatments, and so you are likely to have even the possibility to compare the treatments using these registries. Regulators may impose initiation of product registries, because clearly if you liaise with a drug company, you cannot ask them to collect information from other products of other drug companies. But what you can ask to the companies is to explore the possibility for already employed disease registries, and so to how can I say, implement that specific needed information in other disease registry already employed. I think that Giuseppe already filled out the rationale of why registries in the post-marketing phase. We know that elderly patients are generally underpowered in the clinical trials, and this is a nice example that demonstrates that potential sample of patients based upon these specific trials and based upon the clinical indication, and then the real number of patients after the exclusion criteria used. So, which means that probably, to be optimistic, between 50 and 70% of the patients and the population studied in the context of the clinical trials are then the population that has been treated with the drug in the post-marketing phase. So we miss probably a percentage ranging from 30 to 50% in the post-marketing phase that has not been studied in the context of clinical trials. And raising is another issue in the sense that, for instance, the agent's heart failure registry has been set up because of difference in characteristics of the Asian patients about heart failure, and considering that most of the data from heart failure trials come from Western countries, and so clearly there was the need to develop a registry to understand better the burden and predictors of death and hospitalization among Asian patients. Another point, and this is really important, and this is a growing issue at the regulatory level, is the orphan diseases. Theoretically, or practically, orphan diseases are those diseases affecting less than 5 out of 10 patients, 10,000 patients. And so, if you are developing a drug with this kind of target population, you are able sometimes to have some legislation that helps you to have a marketing application and authorization in a way that is easier, I would say. Obviously, in most of these cases, it's quite difficult to obtain a full comprehensive data set from clinical trials, and therefore pharmaceutical companies may require to collect long-term data in a registry as a part of their marketing authorization. This is the state of the art of how many registries you can find based upon Orphanet. So there are 651 registry, I think is Europe, this one. And these are relevant not only for collecting post-marketing information, but in case also for better design future clinical trials. There are 45 European-based registries or orphan disease, and 71 global that obviously has in Europe a strong base. And so it is quite clear that registries are tools that you can use in the post-marketing phase. You will use registries for assessing effectiveness, which can be comparative or clinical, to monitoring safety and tolerability, and also for other purposes that are measure or improve quality of care, or also to describe the natural history, the epidemiology of the disease. Clearly, depending upon the stakeholders, you can have different objectives. Regulators use and make use of information from registry mainly to detect safety signals and to ensure long-term effectiveness. Physicians, researchers, scientists, for several reasons, including generate publications. That is absolutely reasonable. And now the European legislation provides some framework to help to develop a registry if needed, or also to explore existing registries for the purpose of the PAS and PAES, as Giuseppe already pointed out. In terms of guidance, there are several guidance, but to be honest, I think that the most comprehensive one is from the US, whereas in Europe, you can find some information from the NCEP guide on methodological standards in pharmacoepidemiology, but this is much more based upon pharmacoepidemiological methods, not necessarily applied only to registries, but to any kind of data source. And clearly, planning a registry is logistically really challenging. I don't think like clinical trials, but there is a lot of complexities in proper design registry planning. I would focus on the implementation, so in some methodological tips that I think is quite straightforward because they can also be applied to clinical trials. And so you have to define specifically the objective of the registries, and obviously this is a point that is beyond the concept of the clinical trials, because first of all, before engaging yourself to developing a registry, you just need to understand if there is another existing registry, and so it's useless to develop another one. If there is sufficient data to answer to the research questions, and if the data are accessible, there is a lot of feasibility issues and also legal and cost implication issues if you want to set up a registry. And also, you need to take into account, according to the national regulation, whether there are more strict rules in terms of privacy issues, in terms of falling into the clinical trial directive. And so sometimes you wish to develop a registry in Italy, to make as an example, but in Italy there is more strict rules in terms of privacy, and so you end up having a lot of difficulties in setting up a registry there. Or, for instance, I think in Germany there is much more challenging issues related to the falling into the clinical trials directive, for instance, for off-label use, etc. So you need to take into account all these implications, bearing in mind the clinical trials regulation. Obviously, then, what you need to do is just to focus on the core variables, take into account and be really focused on the variables that are needed to address the objective of the registry, to avoid, because in comparison to clinical trials, obviously, data collection is less strict. So if you ask to fill several information, you probably end up having less quality information into your data source. And clearly what you have to focus on more is patient's outcome and target population. And in this case, I think there is no so many differences according to the, what you need for clinical trials. This is an example that I have taken just to document the fact that registries obviously get very large sample size. The REACH registry enrolled 69,000 patients between 2003 and 2004 in 5,000 centers across 44 countries. And the point here is that the prospective data collection has the advantage, obviously, to collect information based upon clear, defined clinical definitions, mostly, in most cases, based upon established guidelines, of course. And in this case, there was some strict rules on visits, but as I mentioned earlier, be aware that strict rules in visits sometimes means there is the possibility of falling into the clinical trials regulation. So it's just a matter of discussion whether it's better to be more flexible in visits in order to accomplish the objective of keeping the non-interventional nature of the study. And clearly the physician selection for registries is much more important than for clinical trials, because you need to ensure the generalizability of the results, so external validity, which is not necessarily the main scope of the clinical trials. And so, to conclude, the strengths of the registries are clear, because you are gathering information on real-world data about safety and effectiveness. You have, in most of the cases, a large sample size with high heterogeneity of the results, which is a richness of the registries, because obviously you can get more information from more countries, and you have the possibility to understand also the risk factors across the different countries and population. They have potential for improving standards of care, and they are hypothesis generating rather than hypothesis driven like the clinical trials, for instance. And obviously they can also be used for other purposes, like for instance for outcome and reimbursement purposes. In terms of weakness, I think that is crystal clear for you. There is no randomization, and the data quality is not verified 100%. I would say even not verified 70% and sometimes 50%. There is loss to follow-up, and there is the likelihood for underreporting of serious adverse event. The issue of the external validity is always an issue which you need to demonstrate, in the sense that despite the large sample size, this not necessarily means that you have the possibility to generalize your results across all the target population. And clearly, maybe because there is some argument, there is a perceived diminished value of research evidence compared to randomized clinical trials. I agree that clinical trials still remain the main source of generating evidence, especially for efficacy issues. For safety issues, probably we can discuss. So I leave it to this, and you can easily spot the difference between registry and randomized clinical trials. And if you have questions.